Hi all, it's nice to see all of you online so far, but still it's nice to see you. And after listening to this presentation, I kind of understand why these countries were grouped together, because they're very similar trends. If you could go to next slide. Yeah, thanks. Well, for the start, I'm just going to briefly mention that generally Georgian legislation is very liberal. It's based on American model when it comes to freedom of expression or how much radical ideology you can spread. For instance, there is a alt-right web channel which was banned on Facebook, but it got licensed to broadcast on TV. So we have a TV channel which was banned on Facebook, so it's the radical views. But because of Georgian liberal legislation in this matter, they are able to do it on TV. When it comes to key actors and stakeholders for radicalization, we have identified in our report that mostly those are radical Orthodox Christian groups, which are closely associated with Georgian Orthodox Church. And despite Church usually distance itself from any type of violence, usually those are people who are actually associated with the Church. They're behind the attacks on LGBTQ minorities or religious minorities. Also, there are alt-right groups, which are also closely associated with Georgian Orthodox Church, and recently they tried to participate in a parliamentary election, but they didn't score enough to cross the threshold. And there's the political party, the Alliance of Patriots, which is the only populist party currently in the Parliament of Georgia, and they have been known for their xenophobic rhetoric and also for tougher migration, or calling for tougher migration laws. And another stakeholder for radicalization is a Salafist interpretation of Islam. And this is an interesting because currently in Georgia, there's no state-funded or operated Islamic clerical education institution. So if a Muslim minority in Georgia wants to get the clerical education, they have to go either to the somewhere to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, or to Iran, and get the education there. So once they come back to Georgia, the Islamic interpretation they're bringing with them is devoid of local culture or local context. Actually, while I was working on the interviews for the third report, that was one of the points which came out in the interviews, that the Islam they're bringing from abroad is actually not so much adopted to the local context. And then you have this competition between the local elders in the villages and those young people who go and get education abroad and then come back and bring that interpretation of Islam to Georgia. And one more point, which I'm going to talk about the next slide. I'll talk about it in the next slide. And then we have a separate state and partner-led radicalizations. And state radicalization, one of the reasons for this is the dominant position of Georgian Orthodox Church, and usually those priests or clergymen who are responsible for violence, they get away with it and they do not get prosecuted. And then you have a discriminatory practice. For instance, when we had a curfew due to the coronavirus, Georgian Orthodox Church was exempt for the curfew, so they could have their Easter service, but other religious minorities couldn't do the same. Regarding factors behind radicalization, there are major factors, which are the collapse of the USSR, because the economy has shrunk by almost 60% after the collapse of the USSR. Then you had high level of criminality, state institutions basically were not able to provide services. And then in this chaos, you have the Georgian Orthodox Church who managed to maintain stability. And in the end, it became the most popular institution that provided shelter for many who were disappointed due to the failure of the state in the 90s. Then you had the Rose Revolution in 2003, which started with effective reforms. However, the reforms were extremely neoliberal, and a lot of scholars agree that it has somehow disfranchised majority of the population and created a high income inequality among the population, which resulted in marginalization and possible radicalization of certain young people who went more right. And then you have the main motivational factors, which is usually defense of traditional values. And I think this is very similar to what was mentioned about Hungary and also Poland, that Orthodox Christian Church usually argues that there is global conspiracy against traditional families, against traditional values, against Orthodox Christianity, and that they need to somehow save or defend Georgian society against this conspiracy. And when we have instances of violence, which is the attack on the LGBTQ community or attacks on religious minorities, it is usually motivated by this factor that they need to defend it against some kind of attack. Regarding the Islamic radicalization, as I've mentioned before, one issue is that there is no state-funded or state-operated educational institution in Georgia. Second important factor, which also came out of the interviews, was that Islam is seen in Georgia through a security lens, and communities are actually feeling insecure. They don't trust security services in Georgia, and therefore they do not trust their own local leaders, so to speak. And we had the cases when security services intervened in the election process of the local Muft, which is like a leader of the community, like religious community, and therefore young people are actually alienated from their own leader in the Islamic community, and that is an important issue. Regarding the state-led radicalization, here we need to point out extremely high level of polarization, and election is usually being perceived as a zero-sum game. So either winner takes it all and the loser gets totally defeated. So in the end, you have a ruling party which is trying to do everything it can to stay in power, while the opposition tries to present it in a way that either Georgia is going to be safe if they win the election, if they lose, then everything's going to be destroyed and there will be no Georgia anymore in the future. And then you have this kind of the world we're playing out in the election, which leads to polarization and leads to the radicalization. Regarding the radicalization measures, there are almost none. While we're doing research, there are very few. It usually includes some trainings for media or trainings for clergymen where they teach them about tolerance, the language media has to use while covering some sensitive cases, etc. But there's not really substantial long-term program that would address these issues or address, for instance, economic inequalities, especially in the rural areas, which could be the hotspots of radicalization. If you could go to the last slide. And regarding recommendations for the future research, I think party-driven radicalization is something which definitely needs to be looked in, but unfortunately, so far it's been outside of the research in Georgia, at least the party-driven radicalization in Georgia. Another important issue is income inequality-driven radicalization. This is especially relevant because alt-right usually in Georgian reports is dubbed as pro-Russian, and usually Russia is blamed to be behind motivating these alt-right groups. While another reason could be exactly that they are disfranchised, there is a huge income gap, and therefore they turn to this radical ideology, and I think that also needs to be explored further. I think that's, yeah, very briefly about the report.
Thank you very much, Shota. This was extremely good. Thank you.